So, welcome everybody. Apologies for this few minutes delay in starting the meeting. We had to switch from one event to the other, and people needed to switch rooms. I think now it's okay, and welcome also all of those who are following us on online. So my name is Yves Lador, and I represent Earth Justice here at the UN, and I have the privilege of being the moderator for this event on just transition and human rights. So we just had this discussion at the Human Rights Council this morning on the report of the Secretary General on climate change and just transition. And that was quite an interesting discussion with contribution from states, intergovernmental organizations, and NGOs. So we see that human rights is a very crucial element inside this discussion on just transition. And so we'll try to go a bit deeper into this link here in the discussion right now in this event. Just to frame the situation, well, the context, contextualize where we are at this moment. And so in addition to the Secretary General's synthesis report, we're looking also forward to the discussion that will happen at the next COP30 in Belém on the Just Transition Work Program. And of course, you also have in mind the ruling of the International Court of Justice and its very recent decisions linked to climate change, which is extremely important. And here also we see that it has a number of impacts on the question of just transition. And of course, we also have in mind the last reports of the UN Special Rapporteur on climate change and human rights, and the report that was presented at the last session of the Council last June. So with all of this in mind, I will immediately give the floor to our first panelist, Mr. Ben Schachter, who is the coordinator of the Environment and Climate Change team at the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, and one of the key persons in the drafting of this report. So I hope, Ben, that you were happy and satisfied with the discussion we heard this morning. And can you tell us what are the mechanisms within the Human Rights Council that can help ensure us that a just transition really is human rights based and inclusive? So thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours, Ben. Thanks, work.
All right. I don't have a powerful enough hand. Thank you. New room for us, new space for us here. Thank you all for joining on behalf of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I'm really grateful for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak with you all today. And I also want to thank my colleague, Rina Kusapalo, who led the drafting of this report. And I hope many of you were able to join the interactive dialogue, which took place earlier today. But for those of you who don't, I also want to give you a bit of a flavor of that before I jump into a couple of brief points about how the Human Rights Council can move forward in advancing a just transition for all. So first of all, when we're talking about just transition, we've been talking about a broad cross-sectoral approach, the transition we need to sustainable economies and societies. This includes, of course, a transition away from fossil fuels, but it's broader than that. And it includes all of the different actions we need to take to have societies and economies in which people now and in the future can enjoy their human rights, including the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. The report of the Secretary General raises and identifies 4 specific pathways towards just transition. And in that context, and with respect to those pathways, it identifies some specific recommendations and actions going forward. And before I describe those, I want to touch back on a point that Eve just raised, which is the incredible relevance of the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on climate change. That advisory opinion reaffirms the close relationship between climate change and human rights, the impacts of climate change on human rights, and is very clear and unequivocal about the fact that states have legally binding human rights obligations in the context of responding to, addressing, and remedying the climate crisis. All of that needs to inform, of course, our approach to a just transition. So those pathways that we've identified, the first is broadly a transition toward sustainable human rights economies. We need economies that prioritize planetary and human well-being and the realization of the rights of all people, particularly those in vulnerable situations. We need to develop and use measures of progress that go beyond just GDP and economic progress and take into consideration human development, equality, environmental sustainability. We need to phase out fossil fuels. And the SG and the High Commissioner have both been very clear about the need for this phase out to be rapid and equitable. And we also need to advance efforts to ensure sustainable energy for all people. Business accountability is another critical element of this, right? And it's a critical element generally of the human rights framework. Businesses and other actors have responsibilities and obligations within the human rights framework, even though states are the primary duty bearers. And the second pathway we talk about and identified is ensuring decent work, universal social security, and social rights. The transition will create jobs. And it's very clear that the jobs that are created by this transition will far exceed the jobs that are lost. But jobs will be lost. People's lives will be affected by changing our economies and societies. And to make that transition just, there need to be effective measures in place to ensure the protection of workers in the context of the new jobs that are created, and also to ensure pathways for the people and that are affected to access decent work, to have training and capacity building opportunities, to have social security, and universal social security is a big emphasis, right? This builds resilience. It's a key measure in terms of adaptation to climate change and its impacts as well. And so the report talks quite a bit about this area as well. And the third pathway it talks about is strengthening rights-based participatory governance, integrating human rights obligations throughout transition-related laws, policies, and activities, ensuring meaningful and informed participation by affected communities, safeguarding Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination and sovereignty over natural resources and free, prior, and informed consent, and protecting human rights defenders. And this transition will not be possible without environmental human rights defenders, Indigenous peoples, all of society, right? We are talking about a transformation. We're talking about achieving harmony with nature, which is an explicit commitment, for example, of the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And that's why I say it's broader than just the climate sphere. It's really how do we advance and transform our societies in a way that is consistent with the realization of all human rights and the right to a healthy environment for all people now and in the future. And finally, it talks about international cooperation, right? The key element of solidarity and international cooperation, and recognizing that there's an inherent injustice in how the impacts of climate change and other environmental crises have been distributed, how they disproportionately impact people in vulnerable situations that have contributed the least to these crises, and how there is an obligation, and this is something the ICJ advisory opinion talks about as well, right, to make whole the people affected by environmental crises. And it goes into more specific recommendations, but I know we started late and I shouldn't take too much time. So I'm going to jump to Eve's question now, and thank you for bearing with me while I provided some context. The council has a role to play, and certainly the mandate for this report, which came from HRC Resolution 56/8, is very important in terms of directing and guiding the work of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and requesting this report by the Secretary General. Now, the council can also push further, right? There's new resolutions being negotiated here. There's a dialogue, as Eve mentioned, on the rights of Indigenous peoples in the context of just transition. There's the work of the Human Rights Council mechanisms. I'd point out in particular a recent report by the Working Group on Business and Human Rights on extractives. You know, there's a past report that was done in the context of the resolution on decent work, focused specifically on just transition and green transition. So there's a full body of recommendations that have already been made by our office and by mechanisms of the Human Rights Council related to just transition. And now they require action, right? That's the missing piece in all of this. And certainly there are things that can be done in the context of the Universal Periodic Review, for example, to examine whether or not these recommendations, whether or not protection of the environment and sustainable development are really being used to advance human rights through a just transition in that context. But there's also the guidance and direction that the council can continue to provide. And of course, the resolutions that will be negotiated and adopted in the coming month and you know, for many, many years to come, that need to really recognize and emphasize this is the challenge of our time, making the change from the way we live and operate now to an entirely different way where we actually have sustainable consumption and production, where we actually have stopped the multiple planetary crises, including climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And the council plays a really important role there. And I'd say in particular, the member states of the council have to also think about how to take what's happening here and realize it at a national level and also in other international contexts, right? One of the key areas of our work is bringing the work of the council into other spaces, including the multilateral environmental spaces. And so at COP30, governments will be negotiating a new just transition work program. And we will be engaging with states to ask them to make sure it's consistent with the recommendations of the Secretary General's report and the Human Rights Council Resolution 56/8. Because if it's not, we really have to ask ourselves the question, you know, what is the international community doing in all these different spaces where, you know, governments are coming together and agreeing on one thing at the council and doing something completely different at the UNFCCC? Well, then we have a real problem, and we're not going to be able to achieve our objectives of a better world for ourselves now and in the future.
Thank you very much, Ben, for this general presentation. It gives us a good view of the landscape in which we have to proceed. And you're insisting on the question of coherence. I know that it's an issue which is very dear to the heart of our next speaker, Mrs. Elena Cedillo, who's the program executive for climate justice at the Libertarian World Federation. Mrs. Cedillo, faith organizations are still now very much involved in the issues of promoting dignity, equity, protecting vulnerable communities. This is very specificity of your approaches. How do you see this precisely being pursued in the question of just transition? And are you going, as that was a question that can come from Ben, is this something you're going to particularly work on at the next COP30? Thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. And also, I am glad to see that more and more faith communities, faith-based organizations have a voice at the Human Rights Council and also at the UNFCCC climate negotiations. And thank you for this question, because it's very important to reflect on that, on how can we ensure that just transition policies center dignity, equity, and the protection of most vulnerable people. No? I will draw on my answer will draw on the preliminary findings of our research that we are conducting together with Franciscan International, which explore, among others, how faith-based organizations define and shape the concept of a just transition, making clear that climate action cannot be separated from the protection of human rights. As is heard, my answer begins with the affirmation of human dignity. Any policy that seeks to address the climate crisis must protect this dignity, while also safeguarding the ecosystem on which life depends. We were talking in another panel that this, how important is to see this, to talk about the interconnectedness of all creatures. Also, I would like to highlight that when we talk about just transition, this means upholding the full range of human rights, economic, social, cultural, and extending this protection to nature itself. We can see some examples in some countries where the nature has rights, you know, as in Colombia, for example, when an indigenous communities work doing advocacy at the national level and also giving rights to the river. You know? So this kind of advocacy action is something that we need more and more when we talk about also just transition and when we talk about nature. The recent UN Secretary General report mentioned that 54% of energy transition, mineral and metals projects are located on or near indigenous land. So consider indigenous communities whose forests and rivers have sustained them for generations, and who are now facing extreme weather events, loss of land, land degradation, salinization of the coast, shrinking livelihood. This underscores how important is ensure their voices, wisdom, and rights at the heart of the path toward any just transition. The second point that I would like to highlight is justice and equity that must be at the heart of this process. Climate change has been driven largely by developed countries, while those who are least responsible suffer the worst consequences. A just transition cannot perpetuate this injustice. It requires equitable sharing of both the cost and the benefit of change, addressing inequalities and acknowledging historical responsibilities, particularly of high-income nations. And when we link this with the COP, we have the Paris Agreement, we have polluter space, we have common but differentiated responsibilities of nations. Central to all this approach need to be the protection of vulnerable communities. If we are talking about just transition, so workers, indigenous people, women, marginalized groups, climate migrants, groups that are left, these groups cannot left behind or forced to bear the heaviest burden of climate solutions. The people needs must be at the center. The people needs must come first when we talk about just transition, ensuring that most affected are compensated fairly, treated with dignity, and empowered as agents of change. To make this commitment real, I really believe that faith-based organizations as part of civil society play a vital role. In some cases, faith communities are the communities affected by climate change. So we are here to facilitate this dialogue, amplify the voices of most affected, and challenging these so-called false solutions that prioritize profit over people. Remind us that just transition is not only technical, it is moral. In short, a just transition is not only about shifting energy systems. It is about transforming relationships between people, between generations, and between humanity and the whole creation. Faith tradition remind us that justice is not complete until the most vulnerable and protected are empowered. In the end, a just transition is not only moving from coal to renewable energy or from one technology to another. It is about changing the way we relate to each other to our common home. It is about solidarity, compassion, and care. Thank you, Eva. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Elena, for this presentation and for the showing the moral coherence which is needed in order to approach the question of just transition. So let me turn now to Mrs. Lien van Dam with precisely the same type of question of coherence. So Lien, you're senior campaigner for climate and energy at the Center for International Environmental Laws, well-known CIEL. But you're also one of the main coordinators of the working group, the NGO Working Group on Human Rights and Climate Change, which has a long history of being very active in the COPs and actually influential in many ways. So based on your experience, what would you say to negotiators in trying to have this kind of coherent approach about the just transition? And for example, at the discussion at COP30, knowing that this issue is coming on the table, for example, with the work program, how do you approach this?
I manage. Thank you so much for that question and for organizing this event and inviting us to speak. Before I answer your question, maybe I'll start with some context, and Ben already alluded to it, but the context of the of human rights in the climate negotiations is that they are all too often still sidelined when it comes to decisions, implementation, the actual outcomes of the negotiations. There's a lot of siloing happening, as Ben was mentioning. And so even though the Paris Agreement, the preamble of the Paris Agreement affirms that states and parties to the Paris Agreement should respect, promote, and consider their respective human rights obligations in the context of climate action, which is an important paragraph and hard fought. But when it comes to actual implementation, we see that that's not necessarily happening at the moment in the context of the climate negotiations. And an example of that is the nationally determined contributions. This year is a really important year for NDCs. It's the year where countries should have already submitted their new NDCs, and we're still expecting many to do so, especially next week. And that is really the core of the Paris Agreement, that is the country's contributions to the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And in those NDCs, many parties do not take into account or do not sufficiently take into account their human rights obligations when designing the NDCs, when implementing their NDCs, when it comes to the ambitions level set, but also the policies that are being proposed. And all too often we see that NDCs are not taking that important preambular paragraph into account in that context. And another example is climate finance. We know that climate finance projects, and from decades of experience with development finance, we know that if you don't put in place the right safeguards when it comes to human rights, when it comes to environmental and social safeguards, there is a risk that these finance projects can actually harm communities instead of doing good. But when it comes to operationalizing new mechanisms such as the loss and damage fund in the context of the climate negotiations, every time and again, we're talking about these kind of important policies, there's continuous pushback, and we're not managing to actually translate these human rights obligations into a reality into these mechanisms. And so the just transition discussions in the climate negotiations are a really important moment and an important way to actually finally do something about that, to really make sure that the sidelining of human rights in the context of climate action is ended. And so this report of the UN Secretary General comes at a really important time, a couple of months before COP30, where, as Eve mentioned, and Ben as well, there will be an important decision on the just transition work program. So the report, I'm sure you've all read it. It highlights important barriers to just transition, such as inadequate labor rights, social protection, inequalities, corporate impunity, and shrinking civic space. But it also clearly outlines how existing human rights frameworks are critical to a just transition and to supporting a just transition and to breaking these barriers. So what that concretely means for COP30 and for negotiators on the just transition work program is that they cannot just merely repeat how important human rights are. They cannot just repeat the preamble or paragraph, but really they have to clarify what that means and how parties will translate those into action, break the barriers that are mentioned in the report, and really implement the reports, the UNSG reports recommendations. And so the draft that we're looking at that came out of Bonn, that is going to be the basis of conversations at COP30, has a lot of good elements. There is a recognition of the importance of gender and human rights-based approaches, decent work and labor rights, social protection systems, the care economy. There's a lot of important language in there, which is good. It's a good basis. But importantly, rather than merely recognizing that this is important and encouraging parties to implement this and inviting constituted bodies of the UNFCCC to do so, it's important that the work program really outlines how they're going to do so. So really putting forward next steps, practical implementation, for example, guidance to the constituted bodies, and really a recognition that parties have to do this in the context of their national plans, in their NDCs, in their national adaptation plans, to make sure that it actually translates into action. Next to that, it's also important that the work program outlines next substantive topics that it will be addressing. For example, Elena was talking about the energy minerals and the risks that they pose for indigenous peoples, for ecosystems. There is a lot of other things that this work program could address: environmental human rights defenders, how to increase their protection, how to increase corporate accountability in the context of the climate crisis. So the work program can really outline next steps for future work at COP30 already. I think I might be taking a bit too much time, but I think I just want to also mention the fact that we also need to talk about what we're transitioning to when we're talking about the just transition, and an economic system that is rooted in fossil fuels and not grounded in human rights obligations will never deliver the just transition that we need. And so the fact that at COP29 and in Bonn, it was really difficult to talk about fossil fuels in the context of the just transition work program is really problematic. So COP30 must also very clearly set out the end point of this just transition, which is, of course, a full phase out of fossil fuels. And I'll stop there for now. I think there's many other important elements in the report, also thinking, of course, of international climate finance, which is at the heart of an equitable approach to a just transition. But I'll stop there for now, and I can answer questions if needed.
Thank you very much, Lynn. It gives us a very good idea of what's coming up at COP30 in Belém, in Brazil. And actually, I'm very happy now to turn to our next speaker, Brother Rodrigo Perez, who is a Franciscan working in Brazil. And precisely, we know that Franciscans historically have been conducting their faith-based work at the grassroots level. And that's really a very important mark of your movement. And as we are approaching COP30, how do you see these voices from the field, from the grassroots level in Brazil or in the region shape the discussion on just transition, including the discussion we will have in Belém, what we just heard coming from Lean? So thank you really for being with us, Brother Rodrigo, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for the question. First of all, I want to just situate where I am in terms of thinking and about what that is coming from different parts of the world in terms of discussions regarding just transition. Just transition has become one of the most repeated slogans in international spaces on climate energy. Governments, corporations, and even multilateral organizations now, they embrace this language. And it's interesting and it's important in the language of justice to describe the roadmaps for the decarbonization. That's okay. That's important in the issues of human rights. Yet, when we confront this narrative with the lived realities, for instance, in Latin America, you could say in Brazil, Africa, southern countries of Africa, and across the global south, the contradictions becomes clear. What's being proposed as transition, and we could say energy transition, digital transition, military transition, they all put the mining sector on the top of the process because you need technologies for all these transformations. And the so-called climate adaptation, we could talk about the financiarization, monetization of nature, etc., does not break with the system that created the crisis in the first place. So it continues to operate within the hegemonic economical political system, which is precisely the logic that fuels ecological collapses and deepens inequality. Last month, I was participating in People's Dialogue. It's a South-South Africa and Latin American group. We were in Madagascar at the People's Summit of the SADC, the Southern African Development Community. And this People's Summit of the southern countries of Africa and Indian Ocean Peoples Movement, also in the framework of the People's Summits towards COP30 in Belém, the communities and the movements in the final statement, they denounced that these so-called transitions are not genuine solutions. Instead of facing the system, it's adapt to the system, and it doesn't tackle the patriarchal colonial structures. So these transitions are becoming new forms of accumulation, dispossession, and control. The green transition has already unleashed a global rush for critical minerals. We don't need to cite all those critical minerals, extracted with the same violence that fueled centuries of colonial exploitation, land grabbing, forced displacement, environmental devastation, militarization of territories, and repression of communities. This is nothing less than the new green colonialism, painting the same predatory system with the colors of sustainability. We're not discussing, we were just talking in the other panel, we're not talking, we talk about EVs. We don't talk about transportation, we don't talk about the models of transportation. We don't talk about planning and other system, the urban necessities and all this. So this is extremely important. Meanwhile, the crises that devastate our regions, cyclone, floods, droughts, food insecurity, debt, illicit financial flows, and deforestations, they're not natural or inevitable. They are historical results of a colonial extraction and structural violence of global capitalism. So to respond with more extraction, indebtedness, or market-based climate schemes is to reproduce the disease in the name of the cure. So a truly just transition cannot reduce to replacing fossil fuels, which is, we all agree, with free minerals, or digitalizing economies. We used to say now in Brazil, because we used to ask, where are the files of our computers? They're in the clouds. And then we say now, 3 clouds are landing in Brazil. Only the Northeast, on a region where there's drought. And these huge data centers, they consume energy and water. And this is the future of AI. So it's a convergence. So in terms of the People's Summit, that's why it emerged as an autonomous and independent space to confront false solutions. We need to rethink. We need a convergence of social movements, coalition, communitarian efforts, indigenous groups, and from all over the world, united under an agenda of social environmental that goes beyond patriarchal, racist, colonial, and it's more centered in another type of civilization, another type of lifestyle. So this, and that's why the summit, we're not avoiding to discuss the agenda of the COP, but we need to know that living territories and seas and popular sovereignty, it's extremely important. Historical reparation and confront to false solutions, it's important. Just popular and inclusive transition, it's important, but not alone. Against oppression for democracy and internationalism in a world where multilateralism it's falling apart. It's important, but a multilateralism that comes from the base to the top. Just citizen living peripheries, popular feminism and human resistance. 6 axes that are being discussed. So responding the question, from our work with communities in Brazil, we work directly in the issues of extractivism, especially the issue of mining, through churches and mining, and also advising the Brazilian Bishops' Conference on ecology, integral ecology, and mining. So the significance of a clear message is very important. So first of all, I would say by denouncing the falsehood of the so-called just transition, and think about the transformation. And when this transformation would come, by affirming alternatives rooted in the territories. We need to open, because when we, from the South, the global South, we think, who proposed those transitions? Where were this discussion done? Now we have a war for the value chains. EU is being discussed since the beginning of 2000, normatives and how to deal with the raw materials. You know, who is going to control them? Then you have all the issue with China that controls 90% of the beneficiating those raw materials. And according to some scholars, 78% of the US security system, it's independence of China because of those critical minerals. Critical for whom? This was a big discussion in 2003 at the Temat Social Forum on mining and extractive economy. Critical for whom? And then all this war on corridors of markets, you know, the belt. And so you have EU, US, China in a big competition, the other countries going in this direction. So it's very important to listen. There are many, very interesting, especially in the field where I work, what we call Together with the Right to Say No, which is the territories free from mining. I'll give an example in Bolivia, in the department of La Paz, there are 2 municipalities. They define themselves in the law as agroecological municipalities free from mining. So it's a different approach. for the process. Of course, structure will be necessary. Everything in this room comes from structure. But the fluxes, the intensity needs to be determined by another perspective. This is what that was being discussed some decades ago, and this disappeared from the discussion what the so-called post-extractivism. Post-extractivism doesn't mean we're not going to have extraction, but we have a process. It's a process from, we need to leave this predatory system to go for a more reasonable with normatives, etc. But we know the normatives are not sufficient. When the EU discussed the due diligence, what happened now when the changes of the ultra-right in Europe? They fell down. In Brazil, with Bolsonaro, the same thing happened, flexibilization. And now the war in the Congress because of the devastation law. We call the nickname of the law, flexibilization. But to go to what is essential, it means what? We need dialogue, we need discussion. It's a political will, but we need to give voices to the different parts of the world.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo, for these very insightful exchange and views. Yes, I'm not sure you totally answered the question how much the voices of the people will really be heard in Belém, but I think we can guess it from what you just said. So now we have a moment where we can have questions coming directly from the floor. Can I please ask that you identify yourself when you raise a question and tell us if you're addressing it to somebody precisely. I also take this opportunity to say to the panelists that they also have a duty not only to listen to the question, but also to prepare your final sentence. We will conclude in a sentence from each one of you, so you can already start to prepare that so you're not taken at the last second. So please, I have a first request for a question here. If you please want to introduce yourself.
Thank you. I am Dr. Raja Mahmood Sijata. I am from Jammu and Kashmir. My question, as brother Rigo, maybe pronunciation is correct or not. I am agree with his comments about colonialism and the different policies. I am from a disputed territory. The governments can implement, sovereign states can implement these all policies in their areas. But when we are living in a disputed territory and we haven't any sovereign rights there, the government cannot implement policies according to the wishes and will of the people, and even they cannot. They are not bound to take care about the natural resources, environment of that area. For example, in Jammu and Kashmir, one part of that Jammu and Kashmir that is under the administration of India, we have around 7 lakh military there in a small area. We have also military in Pakistani administrated area. We are facing floods from last many years. So what policy can be implemented for these areas who are disputed in nature, and the people haven't any sovereign right there, and so they haven't any role in the policies, and even their voice cannot is not heard by any sovereign state, and sovereign state enforce their policies for their interest, not for the interest of the people of that particular region. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your question. Any other requests for the floor for a comment or a question? Yes, please. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. Bernadette from the Catholic Land Fund. Thank you very much, the Catholic Land Fund. Question to Ms. Van Dam. We saw on the court decisions from regional and international courts quite harsh reactions from certain governments, like Switzerland. How do you perceive this at the UN level? Is this kind of felt as an interference in policy making, or are the governments recognizing their obligations, so that could lead to more forward-looking decisions and more ambitious decisions at COP30, for example.
Thank you very much. Any other? We can take still one more question. So if it's not the case, I'll turn immediately with the two questions I'll turn immediately with the two questions we had. And Lynn, perhaps if you want to start first to give your answer, and then I'll give the answer to, I'll give the floor to Brother Rodrigo.
Sure, thanks. The COP still has to happen, the first COP since the International Court of Justice advisory opinion. So how it's going to be received and welcomed there is still to be seen. But I think what I can say about this is that the advisory opinion is there because all governments, all countries requested it through the UN General Assembly. It was a consensus-based or a consensus resolution to request this advisory opinion. And so we can only expect that all of those countries who agreed that that advice was needed and who requested that advice to better understand the legal obligations in the context of climate change will now actually take that advice to heart and go to COP30 and translate it into a better alignment of the negotiations with international law. Because that's, Ben also mentioned it, but I do think that that is in the broader just transition, but just generally when it comes to climate action, that is one of the main points for this COP is going to really, seeing how this advisory opinion is going to lead to better outcomes across the board, knowing that what we've seen in 30 years of negotiations is unfortunately not only this siloing of issues, but also really an undermining of legal obligations in the context of these climate negotiations. And so that's really an expectation that we have for COP30, that there is going to be a change of course, a change of pace when it comes to the climate negotiations because of this advisory opinion. But we will have to see how it actually transpires in the lab.
Thank you very much. And now I'll turn to you, Brother Rodrigo.
If I was asking here if I understood better, I always like to talk about from my experiences also. When you're talking about those conflicts, conflicts within the communities regarding to the territories and let's say to the common goods. Because I can answer, but go on, explain me better.
I'm asking about the conflicts between the two countries, and the area is a disputed, like Jammu and Kashmir, which is a disputed area, and there is a conflict between India and Pakistan and Jammu and Kashmir. One portion is under control of India, and other portion is under control of Pakistan. And the people of that area, whether they are in Pakistani side or they are in Indian side, they haven't any role in policy making. And the states, whether it is India or whether it is Pakistan, they make policies for their own interest, like mining, like the water. And so there is not any role of the people of that area. So we have in this year, we both side of the Jammu and Kashmir, they have faced floods. We are also facing deforestation. So there are many climate issues on that area. So this I am asking that how this institute, UN organization, or any other their organization can help on for those areas which are not under any whose people have no voice for that.
Yeah, I'm not going to probably respond specifically because I'm really used with land conflicts and territory conflicts, but it's different. It's a struggle for land, for ground reform or mining that are getting the territories, conflicts caused by corporations and mining companies in the use. What we normally used to do is the perspective of empower the people in the territories and for them to find the solutions. Countries like the situation you'll be saying, it will be a little bit irresponsible if I respond for a conflict that I really don't know. And what this means in terms of the cultures of the people, because I think solutions can pass through who the people are and those dialogues. That's why from a certain time, for us, the struggle for land reform is not only for food, it's to empower the people in the territories, because the territories are in dispute in this model of exploitation. So that's what I can say.
Yes, well, thank you very much. And I think it was a very interesting question that would need also more to be deepened, indeed, but it was very, very relevant. So thank you very much for the questions. Thank you very much for the presentation. And I said we would finish on one specific sentence that you'd like to give as a concluding remark, each one of you. So I don't know who want to start first. Lynn, can I just put you on the spot? And one last sentence of conclusion for this discussion.
But I'll keep it very brief, because actually what I wanted to conclude on was what I already answered to the question of the International Court of Justice. I think, yeah, COP30 is really an opportunity to finally bridge this gap that we're seeing between human rights law, climate law, and you know, just generally how we're seeing the siloing of issues that is not leading to the climate action we need. So yeah, let's go to COP30 with this advisory opinion and really make sure that changes for good. So I'm on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I also want to point to the ICJ advisory opinion, but what I want to point to is the very end. It's not really about law. It's about equity and justice and sort of right and wrong and our fundamental human values, right? And that's actually where the court goes at the very end of that opinion. They talk about the need for a whole of society effort. They talk about how we all depend on the environment. And ultimately, we have very complex discussions about this issue, because it's a large issue that affects all of us. Lots of people contributing to the problem, lots of people affected by the problem. But it's also a very simple issue. We are living in a world where we're perpetuating, and by we, I mean certain actors, powerful governments, the rich and powerful and businesses, perpetuating a crisis. And we can stop that crisis. And we know what we need to do. We need to transform our relationship with nature. We need to reduce inequalities. We have the formula. It comes from human rights. We just have to act.
Just to, I was thinking here, it's important to debate, it's important to dialogue, it's important to see what is in convergence and what is in divergence, and to consult especially those who are taking the burn and in the first hands of all this. And just as an invitation, 15th of November, it will be a big march in Belém, but it's a global day of action. And it's been articulated all around the world, manifestations. It's a way to express, it's a way to participate, and it's a way to dialogue. People Summit is very important in the sense that we open again a space for civil society to discuss and debate, and maybe to try to find, together with official agenda, its own agenda, especially because the last 3 ones, there was no possibility for participation.
Elena?
Just brief, I would like to highlight that we have a crucial role to play. So connecting global discussion, all what we are saying here, to the lived realities of frontline communities. Protecting their life, protecting people's life, upholding human dignity, and safeguarding our common home.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of this event. Let me thank the co-organizers, Franciscan International, the Lutheran World Federation, the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, the Geneva Environmental Networks, thanks to who we were able to stream this discussion, all of them being members of the Geneva Climate Change Consultation Group, the GECO. So please join me in giving a hand for the excellent presentation we had from our speakers. And may I ask all the follow-up discussions take place outside so that the next meeting can